Okay, I think we have everyone joining us. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, a very, very warm welcome to today's panel discussion, Compliance Gaps and Confidence Traps. My name's Alistair McDonald. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer with Citation Group, and having worked with the business for over 12 years, we've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of organisations about the challenges that they face in managing their workforces and what keeps them up at night. Now, I'm not a lawyer. My job today is to ask the questions of our panel of experts and then throw to the audience themselves to hopefully cover some of the questions that will be arising based on our conversation. So by way of housekeeping, please do put your questions into the chat function. We'll be trying to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the discussion. Following that, the report that we're actually going to be talking about today will be made available to everyone who has joined us today for the webinar. And then in June, we will be launching a diagnostic tool, which will once again be sent out, which will actually give you the opportunity to assess your own organisation against the findings and statistics that we'll be talking about today. But before we begin, a little bit about our organisation. Citation Group can trace its history back 35 odd years. We started life as a specialist employment relations law firm and remain so to this day with 5 accredited specialists in workplace relations law. But in the bid to innovate over the decades and solve more problems for our clients, we branched out into the technology space, launching our own HRIS and safety software before moving into citation certification, being Australia's second largest certified accrediting body for ISO standards, and driving into HR and safety outsourcing for our clients. Most recently, we've welcomed the team from FoundYou who have joined us and brought payroll and workforce management capabilities to our organisations and our thousands of clients. So, talking about today's report. In February this year, we commissioned Stoltz and Research to do a conversation with over 510 businesses, owners and leaders, and really get into what they are finding is keeping them up at night. This is the inaugural Workforce Pulse report and looks into Australian businesses and how they're actually managing their workforces. There were 510 businesses taken from both small, medium and large organisations across 7 of our largest industries, and we were speaking to business owners, C-suite and a number of senior managers. This report aimed to delve into 5 key areas: HR, payroll, safety, legal and employment compliance, technology, and most importantly, the impact of artificial intelligence. Now, what were the key findings of this report? Essentially, 97% of businesses said that they felt highly confident in managing their workforce responsibilities. And confidence in business can be a very good thing. Overconfidence, however, can be absolutely deadly. When we delved a little bit deeper into the underlying data, we found that there was a real gap between that level of confidence and what the data was actually showing us. And we've labelled this the confidence trap. That is the main theme for today's conversation. Some key findings that we found of interest. Whilst nearly everyone said that they felt confidence in managing their workforce, 3 out of 4 businesses said that compliance is more complex than ever. And 2 out of 3 said keeping abreast of compliance was actually limiting their focus on growth. Now, here's the rub. 42% of businesses said that they had found a payroll error at some point. 60% odd of businesses said that they run fragmented systems, and only 1 in 4 would say that they'd be confident in managing psychosocial errors. So today, I've been joined by a panel of experts who I'd like to now introduce, who'll be talking us through the different areas and key findings. Firstly, to my right is Wes O'Donnell, Head of Enterprise Growth. He has more than 20 years' experience in workplace relations and employment law and works with some of Australia's largest industry associations, franchise bodies and corporates, helping them navigate the kind of regulatory complexity that most businesses don't see coming until it's already arrived. Following that is Lisa Chu, a partner at Citation Legal, who advises businesses on employment law, IR compliance, and the growing intersection of AI and workplace relations. She's the person who sees what legal consequences are of the confidence gap and what that actually looks like in practice. Finally, joining us is Renee, Chief Operating Officer at Citation Group. She works closely with businesses on payroll accuracy, award compliance and systems integrations, and has seen firsthand what happens when this confidence in payroll doesn't match reality. Now, as far as topics go, I thought we'd start at the safety and psychosocial risks that were thrown up in the findings of our research. So, Wes, we know that the Productivity Commission last year said that psychosocial hazards in the workplace were costing businesses somewhere in the vicinity of $40 billion. And when we delved into the research that we conducted, 21% have no structured safety systems whatsoever in managing WHS and are taking an ad hoc approach. 30% of businesses say that mental health in the workplace is their biggest current concern, and 61% find managing that WHS issues stressful, which in and of itself is a psychosocial risk. So, my question to you first. The survey shows 90% of businesses believe they meet the WHS requirements. However, 21% have no structured safety systems at all. How can you make sense of that gap?
Yeah, thanks, Ali. Thanks for the question. Look, I think we've all been surprised by some of the findings that this report has generated. And I think from me, when we look at those particular statistics, it really does show that there is a disconnect between, I guess, business confidence and the compliance maturity of a particular business. And what we're really seeing, particularly in the data that the report has generated from the context of work health safety, is that there is this disconnect between a business's confidence that they understand work health safety risks within a business and are capable in addressing it. But then there's a disconnect between really shallow system maturity, as shown by approximately only 20% of businesses and respondents having a detailed work health safety platform and systems, which of itself, and Lisa can speak to this a little bit later, of itself is a breach of the statutory requirement to have detailed systems in place to address your work health safety and risk exposure. So for me, it really does demonstrate that there is a significant gap with the respondents' businesses, at least, between the level of confidence they have in their ability to manage and identify work health safety issues in the workplace and the system maturity that they've implemented to proactively manage that. And to your point, I think there's a bit of irony coming through some of the statistics, really, in the sense that whilst there's a degree of confidence in the ability that an organisation has effectively managed it, when we look at how that then translates into individual stakeholders' confidence in their ability to execute their own remit, it falls down. Yeah.
And do you think businesses actually understand what psychosocial risks are?
Well, I think, yes, I think they understand it to a certain extent in terms of your obligation to address psychosocial risk. But I think from a practical perspective and how you can identify it proactively and then support the business in eliminating it is a different thing. And it's an interesting point, Renee, because if you look at some of the responses that we've received, a large proportion of the respondents actually lacked the confidence in proactively identifying psychosocial risk. Another really interesting stat was that over 40% of respondents had a lack of confidence in their ability to have difficult conversations in the workplace. Now, if we lack the confidence in having difficult conversations and managing people with integrity and respect, that then flows through in terms of automatically generating exposure to hazards and risks. And it almost generates itself. So I think you're right. I think that there's an awareness, but a lack of confidence, or at least an ability to implement that practically.
And where's that lack of confidence? Does it translate into a higher degree of stress? And it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy for the managers when they're presented with these psychosocial hazards. They're not 100% sure how to address it. And then they themselves are getting worked out in stress. And we know mental health's a very sensitive area. You can't see mental health in the sense that it's not a broken arm or a broken limb, but then the managers themselves are feeling ill-equipped or underprepared to know what they actually have to be doing and to be ensuring they're looking after their fiduciary duty to staff to make sure that they're actually supporting them.
Yeah, look, it's borne out in the data that we were actually seeing, and I found it really interesting to see that, and it cut across all respondent sizes of organisation, if I'm honest. And what we've really seen from the data is a couple of things, Ali, that there is a reduced level of confidence in an organisation's ability to manage psychosocial risk as opposed to physical risk within a workplace. We're also seeing that respondents are telling us that it's a significantly greater time investment to be across legislative amendments, to be across regulation, to be across what I would call modern workplace practices in proactively managing psychosocial risk within the workplace. And what we're also seeing through the data is that a significant proportion of those respondents are telling us that that time investment is adversely impacting upon their ability to grow and scale. Now, I think if you then peel behind that data even further, and we see that there is a large proportion of those respondents utilizing 3 or more platforms or systems in managing work health safety, HR, payroll. And we're also seeing that there are a very small proportion, only 21%, I think, if memory serves me correctly, of respondents utilizing the work health safety system of some, or internal systems of some proportion. We can then see that there's that disconnect coming through the data. Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be a huge burden either to use these systems and to implement these systems. Like a tiny little bit of effort up front actually saves you so much stress in the long run. And I think that's the really important thing to remember as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that managers do have the capability and the skill set to manage psychosocial risk. But as you said, Wes, it's that discomfort in having those difficult conversations. You can't address a psychosocial risk in the same way that you might with the risk of a physical injury. You can't create a safe work manual that says if you don't do this, then you won't suffer a psychosocial risk, because it's all individual. But if you have the systems in place, as Renee said, you can add on as well. It's something simple like a procedure document where a leader can go to a particular place on the system and understand what the process is going to be that they probably are already aware of, but just seeing that set out in a document and saying, yep, I can actually take these steps. I've got the support of whoever else it is in the business. It becomes a much easier conversation to have, because it's not then just fear of the unknown and how do I individually manage this particular person's issues and resolve it. It's, well, what are the simple steps that I need to take to work us towards something that's going to work for the business and the individual as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you look at the data and take it one step further, you see that there is an overall level of confidence in a business's general ability to manage work health safety. We're seeing that that's not necessarily translating in an individual line manager's confidence in being able to manage psychosocial risk, as an example. But then when you look at only 20% of businesses having effective systems in place to identify hazards within the workplace and implementing control measures to address it, that suggests to me that a very large proportion of businesses are actually managing work health safety in an ad hoc manner. They're not proactive in actually developing the capability of their people to have those difficult conversations or to identify psychosocial risk and implement control measures proactively. Now, look, in many respects, I would always say that ignorance is not bliss in the context of work health safety management. You do need to be proactive. You do have a statutory obligation, which I'm sure Lisa can speak to much more than I can, in terms of identifying and proactively implementing solutions. But we're not really seeing that through the data. We are seeing that confidence isn't translating into systems maturity.
And I think one thing it's important to remember is employees and teams on the ground are so much more literate in talking about these sorts of things, and they understand it in themselves so much more as well. So if as leaders we're not keeping up, there's a huge gap there, and psychosocial risks and safety issues in this space are rising. And a degree of that is because, the world is hard, things are hard at the moment, but employees are way, way more literate. So we have to be as well.
Completely agree.
And I think there has been, to your point, Renee, since COVID, exponential growth in people putting their hand up and saying, I'm burnt out, I'm stressed, working from home creates a whole new set of complexities. Do we think, and this is a question for anyone, that there's been somewhat a bit of a tick and flick approach to managing psychosocial in saying, I'm going to put an EAP in place, I've got my employee assistance program, job done, I'll just throw that out to the employees to give them a number to help. But in actual fact, there's so much more risk borne by the organisation themselves to be mitigating those risks in the first place.
Absolutely. I mean, there's now a positive duty on employers to take steps to minimise the risk of injury, including psychosocial injury. And that wasn't legislated before. It was only in relation to physical injury. So being reactive is no longer acceptable if Safe Work were to come and investigate and say, well, look, this person has, or this group of people have now alleged that they've suffered a psychosocial injury as a result of something that's happened at work. The legislators and the regulators would want to see, well, what reasonable steps has the employer taken to minimise the risk of this happening? So you really need to be more proactive these days.
And is this more prevalent in any particular industry? Like, does someone that runs a bar with 30 people have the same sort of requirements and risk if you're running 2,000 people in a cleaning company or a consulting business? Is it pretty similar across industries?
I would say similar across industries. At the end of the day, we're dealing with individuals, and it's not just work that's going to impact them, it's their personal lives as well. So we can't really say it's unique to particular industries. In fact, with small businesses, the risk is probably higher because of the lack of formalised procedures in place. So it really is for every business to consider.
It's an interesting phenomena, like that lack of sort of formalised structure leads to higher risk, even though you may have less employees or potentially what you might perceive as a less regulated environment. It's actually just not the truth. Yeah.
Well, I think there needs to be a process to identify the particular risk in a particular location. And what risks exist will vary depending upon the nature of a particular business, the size of a business. And to your point, those which are engaging with members of the public, there's an increased level of risk through abuse and hostility. And we're seeing that in the retail space. But I think just to pull upon Lisa's thread a little bit further, there is, and I need to emphasize this, a statutory obligation for businesses to undertake a risk assessment and to introduce systems which identify the risks and what control measures a business are implementing to address those risks. But what we're seeing in the data is that only 20% have adequate systems in place. Now, to Lisa's point, there is the ever-present risk that if there is an injury or a safety incident within the workplace, that the regulator has the power to inspect, to attend upon the workplace, to request the production of material to demonstrate compliance with your obligations to introduce systems. And what we're seeing through the data is that a significant proportion of the respondents lack that systems to address the minimum requirement, if ever approached from the regulator. Now, for me, this is presenting us with a very clear opportunity to correct that before it becomes known to the regulator. But it also identifies, to your point, Renee, that we have almost a duty to implement control measures to ensure our people are safe. Now, if we don't have the systems, I dare say that we aren't necessarily taking that a step further and taking the time to identify what risks exist within a particular business and how we can close those out.
Final question. We know that psychosocial injuries and claims and so forth from a return to work perspective take 5 times as long on average as a physical injury. We know that Safe Work New South Wales, for example, has just deployed 20 new inspectors dedicated to identifying psychosocial hazards in the workplace. You've obviously got the stress and the mental toll and the time it takes for a business to address each of these claims and issues as they come up. In your mind, speaking to the audience, what would be the one thing you'd be asking them to do immediately to address psychosocial claims in their workplace?
Undertake an assessment, an honest and objective assessment around your capability. I always say when I'm speaking with clients that no person is born a manager. You need to develop those skill sets, and particularly in the context of how we manage people. And to your point, Ali, it is significantly longer and harder to migrate people back into the workplace effectively after they've experienced psychosocial injury. But also a statistic I read recently, which for me is really kind of significant, is that 2/3 of all workers' comp claims in Victoria are associated with psychosocial injury. Now, that's a significant proportion of workplace injuries associated with that. And that's directly linked with our inability to manage people against, reasonable expectations. And I think for me, undertaking an objective assessment of where our people are at from a capability and confidence perspective will change things, and then translating that into a system to identify and track how we're improving that over time will be the easiest win in a short term.
Thank you. I'd like to pivot a little bit more into the compliance angle from a workplace law perspective. So, Lisa, if I can throw to you, the pace of legislative change since COVID has been exhaustive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can all agree it's been harder and harder and harder for businesses to keep up. And we saw that in one of those key stats right up front, that businesses feel it's becoming more complex, it's harder to stay across it, and it's costing them a focus on doing what they do best, which is running their business. So, I feel that we've created a bit of a compliance lag for businesses in trying to keep up with this pace of change. And if we look at the rules about governing work from home, that was deployed very, very rapidly, almost overnight for some businesses during COVID, to the secure jobs and better pay legislation, closing the loopholes, the introduction of wage theft, respect at work, the abolition of pay secrecy, which we've seen shine a spotlight on potentially some gender pay gaps in different workplaces, domestic violence leave, and the right to disconnect. Now, that is a wealth of change for businesses to try to wrap their head around, all while staying across changes to their own modern awards that have been deployed as well. So in your experience, what are businesses most commonly still missing, and what is the practical risk of this compliance lag?
Thanks, Ellie. I think that's just to name a few of the changes introduced. There's been more than that. And, if business owners are listening to this webinar and feeling overwhelmed by the pace of legislative change, you're absolutely right to feel that way. I don't think I have seen so much change from a legal compliance perspective since the Fair Work Act was introduced in 2009. I mean, since COVID. So it's really been back-to-back changes. And I think the thing that business owners still struggle with, or businesses struggle with generally, is keeping up to date with that reform, but also implementing, again, we're coming back to formal structures and procedures, finding a way to make it easy for their sort of line managers to actually comply with those requirements. So it's not enough just to discuss at the board level the changes that are being introduced and to have HR on side with those changes, but you really need to make sure that business managers and leaders are aware of what they need to do as well. So, for example, we've had introductions to how employers have to respond to flexible work requests. So Section 65A of the Act was introduced, and we're seeing a lot of employees now, especially with a couple of high-profile cases where employees have succeeded in having the Fair Work Commission support their flexible work requests. We're seeing more of those requests come through, and lots of employers are falling down on the small procedural aspects that they need to comply with. So I think it's not just about knowing about the global sort of headline changes, but also what it means to a manager's day-to-day and how they're managing staff. And then getting those procedures in place, that training in place, so that there's alignment across the workforce.
Because it's not just, and it's not just training of your managers, right? There's, as you said, procedures, but then there's the platforms you use, how they tie together, what interacts with what, and then how that ultimately weaves into process and training and everything else. So there's so many things that span off. One piece of legislation change needs so much change in a business in some cases.
Absolutely.
And I think larger organisations, in-house legal teams, general counsels, big legal budgets, throwing a lot of money to stay across it. But the further down you go and the less resources you have as smaller businesses, these changes can seem pretty overwhelming.
Yeah.
And it highlights the next question, which I found probably one of the most concerning data points that we threw up, which was that 44% of businesses have no structured HR approach. Now, when we look at where that was concentrated, it tended to be down in the smaller and the medium end of the businesses that we interviewed. But 38% of small businesses manage it entirely on an ad hoc basis. This is a reactive approach to people management. There is no proactivity in addressing concerns, mitigating risk, ensuring they have the architecture and the framework in place to actually manage their workforce effectively. So when does this start creating real legal risk?
It starts creating real legal risk the moment that someone walks in the door for an interview, because you are already having discussions in that interview about the expectations of the role, whether the arrangement's going to be one of employment or independent contracting. And we all know now that there are certain things that you should avoid asking in interviews, because even prospective employees have protections under the Fair Work Act in relation to discrimination. So if you're not appropriately across those potential risks in terms of what you can say in those interviews, or if you're offering a certain role that is not actually reflected in the paperwork that follows because it hasn't been signed off and broader discussions within the business haven't been had, then you're potentially already entering into a contract from that moment. Obviously, the risk increases as the relationship progresses. So during the duration of that relationship, there may be performance issues that arise that should be managed in a certain way. And that risk, I think, really exacerbates at the end of the relationship. Like all relationships, someone's leaving because either one or both parties are no longer happy or satisfied, and they may not feel they may not hold back in airing their grievances, on their way out of the door. So managing the exit in a way that is respectful and with, to the extent that that's possible, and reducing risk on the way out is really important as well.
Whereas you deal with a number of our largest industry association clients and support memberships, a lot of which have sort of a higher concentration of smaller businesses. Anything to add to that, or anything in your personal experience that you're seeing coming up as being that the negative impact of having a reactive approach to HR and what it means legal
Yeah,
risk-wise?
I think it's also a perception of what HR is as well.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes, and it varies depending upon the size and relative sophistication of a business, but often people view HR as dealing with grievances and disciplinary matters and redundancies or offboarding. But it's natural to then be drawn into almost a reactive model when you view HR in that particular lens. Whereas I would encourage people to lean into it and to think about, well, where is HR adding value from a people capability perspective, a development perspective, an engagement perspective, which almost then circumvents and reduces the level of disputation within a particular workplace. So sometimes I think it's more of the way in which people view their HR obligations and the value that HR adds to the organisation, which naturally leads into a reactive model as opposed to a proactive one.
Agree. I want to pivot now to look at the impact of artificial intelligence on workplace management. I think AI has been the buzzword for the last 2 years. We know the pace of change within the ability of the different softwares, the different large language models and so forth is growing exponentially. Like 90 days is literally the increments in which we see these meaningful enhancements in what it can do. If we looked at how AI is being used within the 510 businesses that we interviewed, 65% of medium businesses are trying to deploy it. Nearly half of small businesses and 73% of large organizations are having a proactive approach to trying to deploy AI meaningfully in all different facets of the business. The stat that really threw us was that only 23% would agree that it's being used appropriately. It feels like it's spiraled out of control a little bit, or in a bid to keep pace with, I guess, both the opportunity and not being left behind, that there's been a bit of mud thrown at the wall to see what sticks.
Yeah.
But then perhaps they haven't kept pace with how it's been effectively managed. I know you're not a governance lawyer, but at least from a governance perspective, what does this mean for an organisation, and what are they exposing themselves to by just opening the floodgates here from an AI perspective?
I mean, I think, as you said, Ali, AI is evolving every second. These AI platforms are consuming more information, so we don't actually know what the legal exposure is going to be the next day or the next 90 days. I think we need to be aware that AI is here to stay. We've heard that. We've all heard that. So it's really important to have governance frameworks in place that are flexible and can evolve with the way in which AI evolves. And what I'm seeing now is that it's no longer going to be good enough for a policy to simply say you cannot use AI and utilize the phrase of AI very generally, or to say you just simply cannot use AI in any work-related duties. Because I think even if a directive is given that you cannot use AI for our particular workforce, I can guarantee you that every single person is using AI in some way, shape or form, even if you're telling them not to. So you can't manage and control what you can't see. So I think it's about businesses really accepting that AI is here to stay. Everyone's using AI. What does AI mean for our particular business? What platforms are we using? There's free platforms that anyone can use, on their personal devices, but then there are also specific tailor-made AI products that businesses can purchase that have different functionalities and different sort of, confidential systems set up to protect business information. So be specific about what AI products are being used in your organisation. Don't be afraid of getting that feedback from the workforce, and find ways to make AI work for the business.
Can I just add to that? I think the data that we saw from an AI perspective can really be highlighted in the context of work health safety. Now, look, we all will promote that AI shouldn't be something that we shy away from. We should lean into it, but we should also choose where AI has application within a particular business and where it can add value. Now, the difficulty with AI is it lacks experience, it lacks context, but also it shouldn't replace human thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So in the context of work health safety obligations, to implement effective safety systems, to identify risk and a solution to minimize those exposures, AI is not a system, all right? Asking it to produce a risk assessment for you lacks the internal knowledge of a particular workplace, the way in which work is performed, the technology in that particular location, and the intrinsic knowledge that you have as a business owner or a leader around the risks in that particular location. Use it to operationalize it or to create efficiencies, but it shouldn't be a substitute for undertaking the process yourself and the knowledge that you apply.
So you're saying ChatGPT said I could, would not stand
It
up in
won't.
court?
No.
Look, I think it creates another confidence trap, because people think that because AI confidently will answer something. I'll give you an example. I had a client give me a position description, said, I want to create this position. What modern award would it be covered by? There's about 122 modern awards right now. I said, this is the title. What's the award? I had a couple in mind, and AI confidently said, this is the award. And I knew that award did not exist. So I said to AI, is that a real award? And they said, oh, good intuition, Lisa. My apologies. That's it, actually.
That was very intuitive of you, Lisa.
And that's from, my experience. I knew that wasn't correct. And I've had, clients say to me that our leaders want to use AI to record and transcribe certain performance meetings, because we're having a lot of employees disputing what was actually discussed in those meetings. But there's that confidence trap in relying on an AI transcript as an accurate reflection of the conversation. Because if anyone has used any transcription services of AI, you can see sometimes that it doesn't capture what was said accurately. So then it creates this whole level, another level of risk as well. So it's, AI is there to assist, but it cannot replace human thinking and intuition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
From the issue of that reactivity versus proactivity, is there a role for AI to help businesses, whilst it can't be the all-encompassing solution, actually take a more proactive approach in HR? We've seen it with applicant tracking systems and so forth, screening out the hundreds of CVs you might get for one JD. So I think there are practical uses for it where it can be an aid, it can be a time saver.
Yes.
But I mean, is it something businesses should be embracing to help with people management, but not having that, don't worry, Claude's got this in hand for us, so my job done?
Absolutely. I think and it's only going to get better. Let's be realistic about this. It is only going to get better. One thing that I have found it's incredibly helpful for is simplifying language, simplifying legislation, simplifying advice, and bridging the gap between, I guess, advice and the practical application on the ground. And as you said, applicant tracking and things like that. Again, that's a place where over the last 2 years, AI has really, really pushed forward in that space. But it's actually almost getting to a point now where it's so specific and it's so good. What is the gap of missing out on brilliant applicants that don't fit as strict criteria? So while it is getting so much better, it can help us be efficient. To your point, you don't want to lose the human element. So we need to keep those things in mind. But from the point of how we onboard our teams, how we review information, how we review shift efficiencies, all that sort of stuff, it is so incredibly powerful. I think we just need to be really, really aware of what we are using it for. Is this the last line of defense, or is it the first gate? And I think that's a really good way to think about it. Yeah. Are we using it to create efficiencies where risk is kind of low, or are we using it to make really fundamental decisions about compliance, about how our teams experience our businesses and their sort of employment life? So there's a few gates there you just really have to think about. Don't hesitate in using it. That is not the message at all. But just know what you're using it and what the risks are.
100%. Last question on AI before we leave the topic. One thing I think sometimes as business leaders we might forget is that our employees have access to the same tools. And one thing we've seen is the speed, complexity and sophistication in which employee-related claims are being generated quite easily, perhaps, over a glass of wine at night for 5 minutes. And I mean, these are very, very well structured, at least from a legal perspective, to look at. You'd think employees are more aware of their obligations and more aware of their rights and responsibilities, and a feeling that AI is allowing them to compile their claims and put it up. What's that mean for ourselves as business owners or responding to those claims? And can we keep up with the pace and sophistication in which they're being thrown up to the business?
It certainly increased the workload of employment lawyers like myself out there. But also I'm finding my clients are dealing with an increased volume of internal grievances. And just because of the volume that they're receiving, it's no longer commercially feasible in some cases to have a lawyer assist with every single claim. So they're taking on a lot of that sort of grievance and dispute resolution function on themselves and using AI to assist. That can sometimes be, that has its time and place for things that are relatively, straightforward and aren't complex. But as we know, you don't know what you don't know. So what may look like something that is quite simple to resolve can be quite legally complex. And in these applications that we're seeing that are AI generated, AI will not often be able to hone in on what is legally relevant to that claim. So we're seeing courts are receiving swathes and volumes of irrelevant material, and employers who are trying to run that through AI or resolve that grievance on their own are also then diluting the focus and strength of their response, because they're also engaging in, well, this happened on this day and that person said this, but this is actually what happened. And a lot of the time when I look at these things, I said, that's completely irrelevant. There's only one or two things in this application that we actually need to respond to. And if we're responding to everything else simply because AI has generated that in the applicant's application, then we're really losing focus and potentially impacting on the employer's strategic positioning to try and settle that dispute at the heart of what really is a dispute. So I think that AI can be helpful, but it can also be create a lot of noise, and sometimes getting that human view on things is going to help with cutting down all that noise.
It's so interesting too. It's like so low risk and easy for employees to utilize this to make claims and things like that, but it's actually such a high risk endeavor for the employer to use it. So there's a real disparate sort of use case in those scenarios and like where the risk lays.
Yeah.
Okay, Renee, if I can throw to you a little bit on the findings of payroll and technology from the report. So again, we saw this confidence trap arising in the sense that there was a 87% confidence when it came to payroll, and yet 42% of respondees had found an error at some point. Now, we've seen wage theft and payroll compliance take down some of the biggest scalps in the Australian ASX 200. Like some of the most well-known names in the Australian market have fallen foul of this. How does this gap exist in the people that we've interviewed where they have a high degree of confidence and yet they can point to the fact they've found errors?
Look, I think there's a few things there, right? So firstly, the idea of wage theft. Most employers don't intentionally go out to take money from their in fact, they're actually trying to do the opposite in so many cases, and that's that confidence thing. It's like, well, I'm not doing that, so therefore I should be fine. So there's that element of it where I think in most cases there is there is goodwill with employers, of course. The other bit of it there is that 42%, how are those errors found? Because in many cases, they're employers that are actually undertaking audits or where employees have flagged, hey, I don't actually think this is right. And payroll inherently is a trust exercise. So our teams, our employees trust us that what's on our payslip is correct. And that's the thing. So they're not normally going and looking for issues. So if we're not auditing and we're not taking a proactive approach to checking on an ongoing basis, and the employees really aren't doing that either, how are we finding these things? And when we do implementations, what we get a lot of the time and what we see in personal experience is employers come in and they say, yep, we're all good with payroll, and you start deep diving. And what you actually find is people don't understand the nuances of an award. And I don't know if you've actually read an award. I'm sure you've read an award, Doc Wes. Yeah, once or twice. I don't know if everyone listening has actually read one from end to end. It's not very fun reading, but there are so many sort of little bits and pieces that you need to accommodate, both in your payroll processing, but operational context that you need to incorporate. And what I mean by that is, when you roster someone, that has direct effects on your payroll processing, how you onboard someone, the information you have at the point of onboarding, the things that they're doing in their roles every day, that provides operational context. And unless you are sitting down and reading a whole award, I don't know how you could be that confident.
Especially if it's the Shads Award, which we know sends some of us cross-eyed.
Yes.
One thing, and I think you've hit the nail on the head when it came to the onboarding and the need to ensure we've captured the right data and are able to flow that data through down into our payroll. But one thing that stood out to me as a bit anomalous was businesses using outsourced payroll are actually less confident than those managing it internally. And I can't quite correlate why that risk exists, but in your opinion, do you think it is because people either have apprehensions about what data, the setup and how that's flowing through into the payroll, and it's a little bit like out of sight, out of mind, but at the same time, they know the problems if they get this wrong. They know they'll be labelled as someone that's gone out to deliberately rob from their employees?
I think it's that, but I think it's also back to the operational context piece. Like, how does an outsourced payroll provider understand if Ali has worked as a team lead for half of his shift? Like, how do you have that operational context unless you have really, really strong systems that are knitted together in a comprehensive way that ensure data integrity? Otherwise, if you're looking at payroll in a silo, that's where a lot of risk occurs. And in many cases in outsourcing, it is looking at payroll as in a silo. Payroll is the responsibility of the whole business. It really, really is. So I think that's where, in my opinion, that's where some of the risk is. If those people aren't working in your business every day, they don't know the decisions your leaders are making, we need to have a really close eye on what's occurring.
Amazing. 58% of businesses said that they are running fragmented systems. To me, that would erode my confidence level, especially the how integral data integrity and the flow of data between systems is, especially in the modern age with how much we're dealing with. But a lot of these businesses are still saying they have this high degree of confidence despite not having those optimized systems that actually talk to each other or integrated all the way through. So in your experience, what does typical integration failure look like, and what can be the consequences?
This is my favorite topic ever to talk about. Excellent. So if you think about what fragmented systems mean, right? Could be an external safety system. It could be an external HR system and another payroll system, and maybe a rostering system over there that some of the business are using and some aren't. That's an example, right? When you onboard an employee, you have to ask for information. That information pertains to safety. It pertains to superannuation. It pertains to payroll. It basically covers everything, and that's in one singular process. So if that information isn't being sufficiently pushed into a safety system, if it isn't being pushed into a payroll system, and if it isn't informing rostering as well, then how are you making good decisions at every level? And how are the people making those decisions every day, whether it's a rostering decision or whatever else, how do they have the contextual information to make the right ones? And I see a lot of the time when someone, has a really great rostering system, perfect, that information between rostering and then payroll, how that information comes out, maybe it's a CSV file, maybe it's an integration, but how does that then get knit together with the level that someone is assigned to under the award? Or how old they are, or whatever else these things have a relationship to. So that's where the breakdown is the contextual information at every stage.
Yeah. But also the consistent adherence to systems usage as well. 100%. So in some of the more significant remediation and underpayment matters that we've seen publicly communicated is where they may have robust rostering systems as an example, but the time and attendance capture of data is inconsistent or wrong, where people are working longer hours, overtime hours, which aren't recorded, taking breaks which are not recorded within the system. And that leads to a natural error in the throughput, which is payroll. based upon incomplete or inaccurate data from the outset. So I completely agree with you, but where we're also seeing a bit of a disconnect is where the practical and consistent application of those systems fall down as well, which then naturally leads to an error.
And this is, sorry, Lisa.
Okay. I was just going to say, the more there is the opportunity for manual changes and adjustments to data,
100%.
the higher the risk is. And I think it's really important. We've been talking about payroll as a system. It is a system. And when you have a system of different platforms that are not integrated and don't speak to each other, and there needs to be some sort of manual transfer or manipulation of data from one system to another, that's what goes in from a time and attendance perspective, and what's spit out in terms of what they get paid is likely to be discrepancies and underpayment claims that you know, look at an entire workforce over 6 years and you're all of a sudden looking at a very, very dangerous
100%.
territory.
And when you don't have the linear platform, it requires an interpretation of data at each point.
Yeah, that's right.
And when you have an interpretation point, it naturally leads to the ability to actually have user error or some interpretation error as well.
And aside from just like standard compliance, there's also like an efficiency thing, and there's also like a cost to the business thing. And what I mean by that is simple rules like if you're not capturing the start time of a break in some industries, then you don't know when that break occurred and you end up having to pay a meal break penalty. Yeah. So these sorts of things have a direct cost to businesses if you're not doing the right thing. And again, a lot of businesses just don't even know these rules exist in some cases. So systems are very, very
amazing. Look, we've talked about confidence a fair bit and the fact that it's probably untested within the minds of some of the respondees and probably not something that they've yet earned, if I could use that word. What's the one question that every business owner watching today should be asking themselves, do you think?
Do I have visibility over my workforce, what they're getting paid and why they are getting paid that?
Do I have a strong AI policy in place?
I like the word visibility. My approach when I have this question or raised with me from clients is do a 30-day review. Have an objective assessment of how robust are our systems and processes and an objective assessment of our people capability. So from my perspective, visibility is the key.
Visibility, okay.
And with those reviews too, like a lot of the time people do a review when they change systems or when there's a significant event. Maybe it's a piece of legislation changed if you're really good at staying on top of these sorts of things. But how often should we be running these reviews? Because I feel like that's where a lot of the risk is. I did it 2 years ago. Yeah. I'm all good.
Yeah. But I think also, and Lisa can probably speak to this point more, I don't think there's anything wrong with issues or matters being identified through that review. It's far easier to address matters proactively before they become known to your employees or a regulator. So it's almost critical for your business continuity and success to be able to identify pain points within your organization and to devote the resources to actually address them before they become escalated out of the business.
And some things will need to be reviewed more regularly, obviously. We had the Coles and Woolworths decision that was issued September last year. So organisations that were reviewing people on annualised salaries and doing a boot test every year because they felt confident that they had benchmarked the salary appropriately for the year and now having to potentially review pay every pay cycle, which is difficult for a lot of employers. But, as long as you've got regular touch points in place to reassess what needs to be reviewed, I think that, something every quarter at least is necessary. I think a review at the end of the year is no longer going to be enough with the pace of change that we're seeing.
Amazing. Look, we've come right to the end of today's segment. We've spoken about a lot of the findings, a lot of the things that are emerging out of the report and the data that we've done. The report will be made available and distributed to everyone that's joined us today. We've asked ourselves a little bit about what should businesses be asking themselves. What would you do as the owner of a 50-person business? What would be the two critical steps that you'd be taking right now off the back of perhaps some of what we've spoken about today?
I would say understand whether modern awards cover your workplace and they most likely will. So do you understand which ones cover your workforce? And secondly, and are you familiar with the clauses of those awards? And secondly, how are you supporting your leaders in managing difficult conversations in the workplace?
That's a good one. I think that leadership piece is really, really important. For me, I don't think business owners like the word audit, but you do have to do whatever you want to call it. Do a check. Do people have the right levels applied for the work that they're doing? And running through a few timesheet scenarios, so ensuring that you understand your award, the conditions, and a bit of an audit on your pay.
Yeah. So I echo the comments of both Lisa and Renee. From my perspective, I think we need to undertake a review of systems, not necessarily platforms, but systems within an organization, both from a HR, payroll, as well as work health safety perspective. And what we're really seeing through the data is that confidence piece doesn't necessarily translate into maturity, but individual stakeholder or line manager confidence. So I think to Renee's point, also looking at an individual line manager's capability to deal with some of these matters is also really essential, and then be proactive in developing their skill set in that area.
Wise words. That brings us to the end of today's discussion. I would like to very much thank Lisa, Renee, and Wes for joining us and giving up their time. We look forward to getting everyone's feedback on the report that will be getting sent out, as I said. But once again, thank you so much for giving up your time to join us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.